Hi, it's Luke again coming at you from the shop, and we're going to talk about brakes. Now, brakes are a really simple thing in most people's minds, and they should be for all intents and purposes, especially older vehicles where you don't have anti-lock and all that fun jazz. And in particular, we're going to talk about having the right master cylinder, the right proportioning valve, and proper routing of the lines out of the master into the proportioning valve and then out to your calipers and or wheel cylinders, depending on the brake systems you have. The vehicle that I'm going to show you first came in. It had a disc drum master. It had a universal 5-port proportioning valve, which isn't really a bad thing. It makes for a little bit more complex brake routing, but a 4-port, 5-port, there's really no difference between them as long as you have everything set up the way it should be relative to the system. It's going to work the way it should. And we're going to talk about why proportioning valves are important and why certain ones are preferable over others. So if you come in here, you can tell that these two pots on the top are roughly the same size. And if you were to look in here, there's a split in between the two reservoirs. Now, two reservoirs, because technically this is two pistons that run in tandem with each other inside. So one's in front of the other, and they both get actuated from the brake pedal rod back here, pushes forward, and moves both at the same time. And inside down, if you were to go inside here, there'd be two holes on each one. One is to let fluid down in to the piston area so it can get pushed. And once it gets pushed far enough, that fluid becomes trapped, goes through the lines, goes out, down to the brakes, yada, yada. If it's not properly working, or let's say in a normal style valve, a prop valve with a needle valve in it, let's say you lost a front or wheel brake line somehow. Well, what it would do is it would shift the valve inside relative to pressure, would cause it to move and block those passages off. And that would prevent you from losing all the fluid or losing all the brakes completely. And also what it does is when that happens, you'll see a little geyser. Even if you touch the brakes a little bit, you'll see like a little bubbling up coming out. And on a normal operation, when you hit the brakes, you shouldn't really see anything as far as fluid movement. You shouldn't see any little noticeable flow patterns pushing up through, because that's exactly what it will do. And if you hit them real hard when the pin is tripped, it'll spray it. And if you really got your master cylinder prop valve stuff jacked up, you'll have both of them just spraying fluid right up whenever you pump the brakes. It'll literally push through the reservoir fluid and make a little geyser just coming right out, mini Old Faithful. So, and that's with the pin type. Now, this style is an aftermarket style from Willwood. There's no pin inside here to actuate, if you lose a brake line. Because basically, the reality of it is, if they're completely separated from each other, which they are from here all the way down through here, you're not going to lose all that fluid or all that much before you realize there's a problem with your brakes and that you need to get off the road or pull over as soon as you can. It's not, you're still going to have one set of the other set if you lost a hose at one of your wheels or lost a seal on a caliper, whatnot. So that's what's nice about this setup. The pin types cause other problems at times. And then back here is what they call a proportioning valve. And this allows you to dial in the amount of pressure in the vehicle relative to the front brakes, because when you hit the brakes in a car, the weight transfers to the front tires. The front tires do most of the braking force. This allows you to get it so the rear tires won't lock under heavy braking. And, if you had to smack the brakes real hard going around a corner because a deer jumps out in front of you, whatever, maybe in the road, instead of going full drift mode when you pound the brakes, this allows you to proportion them properly so you stop evenly and correctly. And that's, if you notice right here, as far as brake line routing, it's coming out of your two ports from each piston that's in this master cylinder. And they're coming down and they're going to the inputs, and there's front input and rear input. Willwood's nice, they labeled it all for you. And right here, like, there's a rear output and the two front outputs. So this is a 5-port, so you get one to each front caliper and one line that goes back to the T on the rear axle. 5-port. They do have 4-port versions. In a 4-port, you would run out to a T for both the front and the rear set of brakes, and then the T would go to the left and right side, front and back respectively. And Yeah, that's the other thing with this one. It came in, had a universal style proportioning valve. They blocked the rear port in it with a plug and then teed the other two sets of brakes off of that. And the problem with that is it was shifting the valve and causing the bypass fluid, and the rear brakes would never pump up because you never get nothing out of them. And even when you could bleed them to get something out of them, you could basically grab the tire with someone full force in the brakes and just spin it by hand. So that's why routing and proper parts is important, especially if you're building stuff with higher than stock levels of power, or capable of more speed than they were ever capable of stock. I mean, this truck is a 48 Willys here. It's got a big block Chevy in it. It weighs about 2,300 pounds. And even though it's a relatively stock, unmodified big block Chevy, that's way more than enough power weight to get you in trouble. So if we go over this other car that's in the shop right now. The shop has had its fair share of, like I said in the other video, bad work projects, abandoned projects by other shops because they just get to a point where they get bound up and they can't get the work done. They don't know how to proceed, etc., etc. But we're about to show you what improper brake line routing looks like here. So if you look here, you'll see master cylinder. It is the proper disc type. This car has disc front and rear. You'll notice it has just the standard universal style proportioning valve. You can also see this little light here, this little sensor, is actually a ground side switch for if you had an idiot light in a dash, and if for any reason this pin inside here is a pin right here that controls the circuits and how the brake, if you lose brakes, this pin valve right here at the end, you'll see this little here right there. Basically that'll shift and block off those circuits, and that should be good. If you lost brakes for, say, whatever reason, let's say you lost a hose, blew a line in a hose out of the caliper or the wheel cylinder. Or you had a brake line rust through. That's what it's meant to do. It's meant to stop you from losing all the fluid out of it. Now, when it does that, as I said before, the pin moves, it bypasses the circuits, and it pushes the overpressurized fluid, because now you're trying to move XYZ volume of fluid down the line, and it can't move that far. There's nowhere for it to go. It bypasses back into the master, and that causes the geyser effect, as I talked about earlier. If you look carefully at this, you'll notice that this here and this sensor here also typically marks your input side. So let's see if he's got that right. So you got this line here out of the front of the master coming around, back, around. Oh, wait a minute. That's on an output. What about the other one? Well, yeah, he's got that one on the right side. So what kind of proportioning problems would this cause, even if it were able to work? So think about this. He's got one of the front brakes tied into the rear brake port. The other front brake's on the proper, is on an input side of it. And therefore, with this 5-port configuration, the proportioning, even if it could work, would be one of the front tires instead of the rear tires, one of the fronts. So if you hit the brakes really hard, it would steer you one way or the other. And in this one, because of the input side having an output and output having input, basically it just causes a full bypass of the master. So both cylinders, both of the pistons in the master, will just push fluid right up through both reservoirs like a geyser. Even with the lightest amount of pressure, you'll see it. And that's the giveaway. If you hit them real hard, there'll be a little, everything's working right. You'll see a little disturbance in there, but it's not nothing. For how hard you're hitting them, it's like nothing. But when you can see a little bubbling up with just an easy push on the brakes, that's an indicator of something wrong with the prop valve or routing. So this car was built by a shop, and they charged the customer to do it right. In reality, they damn near killed their own customer. And this is what pisses me off. You work really hard to get yourself a reputation, and then nothing's worse than telling a customer comes in, they have they don't know why certain things are wrong, certain things don't work right with their car, and I'm going to tell them, yeah, you got ripped off. It makes you feel bad, especially if someone like myself, I got pride in what I do, and I love doing what I do. And it makes the industry look crappy as a whole, because this is probably the fourth project in a year where we have major safety issues and major issues like this coming in. So to me, 4 in a year is way too common. And that's not, this car also had a litany of electrical issues to boot. And we'll show you the last brake safety issues that this car had. Now, I'm gonna say this, the owner is actually fortunate. This car only ever drove 7 miles out of the shop and quit running, never to be able to be rammed down the road under its own power again. From this issue with the brakes aside, there was one more. So, if you look there, you'll notice some fresh paint on the axles. So, you'll notice that there's some fresh paint here and here. This is where I had to grind the ground. So when you're paying for a shop to do things the right way, this is a sign of it, and I'll explain that in a second. But we're just gonna move this light so you can see this all properly. So the brake tabs were up here. And if you look, you'll see that black mark on the exhaust. The original tab was over here, and this rubber line was routed in between the exhaust and that. So every time it hit a bump, rubber lines hitting hot exhaust, that's a few hundred degrees, just melting through. So we made our own tabs, welded them on the axle, reinstalled it, bled the brakes. And that's when I realized something was wrong, because the brakes back here, when I pulled these lines the first time, I didn't even get a drop of fluid out of them. I couldn't figure out why. The prop valve is why. But this line here, for people who are uninitiated to the world of welding, and specifically welding on things with bearings, you grind this off over here because there is no bearing here to here. If I would have put the ground over here, which I could have easily done at the edge, there's a bearing at the end of the housing. If I would have put it on the pumpkin, which I could also done because there's these handy bolts to just ground to, there's a bearing right in here. So the electricity from the weld will pass through those bearings and micro weld the bearings to the races. And then, a few miles down the road, when your rear end's shot, the bearings are all gone. That's why. Because you put the electricity through them, it causes micro welding, that damages and spirals with excessive wear and premature failure of the bearings, even if you got the proper amount of fluid. So that's why there's this little shiny spot here. I have a magnetic grounding post, has a copper plug and a magnet, and it pulls that all tight. I can just ground right to there. And then my ground goes from right here where I'm welding right to here. There's no bearing material. There's nothing in here. It's just a hollow tube. There's no way it can go through the things it shouldn't. So that's why you pay the money to the shops that know what they're doing. It's little things like that that make a big difference. It's big things like the safety issues that would have got this guy killed had he been able to drive the car for the past year, sooner or later, or just cause a really severe accident that you pay for. And now the customer has the joy of having to pay for it twice. Nobody likes that. No one likes finding out that they bought a pooch, no matter how good or bad it is, And the rest of the car, actually, I'll say this for the car, the rest of the work in the car is actually pretty solid. Really nice body work, really nice framework. Everything else is actually really good. It's just shops that don't pay attention to the details on things. Oh, yeah, it's got this awesome motor, overdrive trans. Ooh, they wow you with the cool factor. And most customers will never know the difference that, where these guys probably charge them 10 grand to do their electrical wiring and their brake lines, as far as labor go, to put this all in. They shouldn't have charged them 2 grand for what they gave them, because it was just a flat out failure and dangerous. That's why I say, to the shops that do it right, kudos to you, good on you. To the people that are doing it wrong, you should just drive yourself over a cliff instead of your customer.